overview of, just wanted to give a quick overview of factory farm gas and why it's an important topic. So Molly, can you pull up the first slide? Thanks. So to take a big step back, factory farm gas is produced on industrial livestock operations. Industrial livestock operations are also known as concentrated animal feeding operations, called CAFOs, or factory farms. These facilities confine thousands, and in some cases even hundreds of thousands of animals without access to pasture. This creates a number of problems, but the fundamental issue is simply that this model puts too many animals in one place. And as a result, it generates huge, huge quantities of waste. And by waste, I mean poop. So to give you a sense of scale, a dairy CAFO with 11,000 cows will produce about as much waste as a city of 250,000 people. Now, the city will build a sewage treatment plant to safely process that waste. The CAFO will stick all that waste in a big hole in the ground called a manure lagoon and hope for the best. Unsurprisingly, lagoons are a major source of both air and water pollution. One of the air pollutants that are generated by lagoons is methane, which, as we all know, is a potent greenhouse gas. So recently, oil, gas, and big meat corporations have very successfully lobbied to secure huge public subsidies for constructing digesters to produce biogas under the auspices of mitigating these methane emissions. Basically, what you do is you take all the waste, you put it in an oxygen-free environment, you allow bacteria to break down the organic matter, and then you capture the gas that's produced by that process. And that gas is mostly methane and carbon dioxide. So you can see in this slide, that's an example of a digester. So you can then burn that gas for either heat or electricity, or you can further process it and inject it into a natural gas pipeline. Next slide, please. That one. There you go. So this all sounds appealing, but other than potentially reducing methane emissions slightly, digesters don't do anything to fix all the problems caused by industrial livestock operations. And in fact, they actually cause new forms of air pollution, and they can exacerbate water pollution. This is a very important takeaway here. Digesters don't actually make all that CAFO waste magically disappear. After all the gas is extracted, the byproduct is called digestate, and digestate has a higher concentration of nutrients and a higher water solubility than raw manure. And as a result, it has a higher water pollution potential. You can see in this diagram here at the bottom, you also have new forms of pollution created because the biogas has to be burned and that releases pollutants. But then the biogas also has to be transported either by pups or either by trucks or pipelines. Now the big oil and big gas guys love all the trucks and pipelines, but for the rest of us, that's not what a sustainable future looks like. We've also found that after installing digesters, CAFOs tend to increase their herd size, which further increases this pollution potential. We encourage you all to read the Biogas or Bull report that SRAP and Friends of the Earth published earlier this year, which delves into that in great detail. I should also note that this technology is really only viable on large industrial livestock operations. So if you're operating a small pasture-based dairy, you're not going to be going out into the field, picking up all the poop and put it into a digester. It just doesn't work that way. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, huge state and federal dollars are now being allocated to biogas, both to subsidize digester construction and to incentivize biogas production. Despite this, it turns out that the methane emissions, the methane emission reductions are highly variable and uncertain due to a complete lack of monitoring, and they're likely very much overstated by EPA. So to kind of summarize all this, we're subsidizing a technology that's extremely expensive, not proven to be particularly effective, and on top of that, it's incentivizing the largest polluting farms to grow bigger, further impacting surrounding communities and exacerbating environmental injustice. And with that, I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Molly Armas.
Thank you so much, Chris. So, Chris did a great job of sort of laying the foundation of really what's going on in terms of incentivizing and encouraging both the building of digesters and the growth of manure biogas production. And so we did a deep dive into a California community, Tulare County, really looking at that growth of factory farm gas. And, this was based on research, looking at, doing a real public literature review, interviews with residents as well. And part of the reason we picked Tulare County is it's a major source of agricultural commodities in the United States. It also has the highest number of dairy CAFOs in California. It's home to about a third of California's dairy cows. So that's a lot of manure, a lot, right? Millions and millions of tons of manure, in fact. And it's a really, really industrialized community as well in terms of dairies. So we found that between 94 and 97% of the dairies have 500 or more cows. So these are really big operations. And just 30 years ago, only about 58% of those dairies had 500 or more cows. So we're really seeing these dairies getting much larger and a lot fewer of them. Tulare is also a very diverse community. About 67% of residents there identify as either Hispanic or Latinx. About half the families there speak a language other than English at home. But it's also, unfortunately, because of the significance of agriculture in this area, like a lot of the Central Valley where it is located, is beset by environmental and public health concerns. Let's see if I can change my own slides. And so both water quality and water access are an issue, as well as air quality. And I want to say, right, not all of this is because of the industrial livestock operations that are in Tulare County. Again, the Central Valley has a lot of agricultural production, but there are a lot of issues that can be directly traced right back to the dairies and their manure management strategies. So for example, right, California dairies use a high amount of water. One report showed about 142 million gallons of water daily. And I put a little asterisk on that because that's just the water for the cows to drink and to wash the animals in the building. So that's not including any of the water to feed the cow to grow the feed for the cows or any of the water used in manure management. That's equivalent to like 215 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And when you add in digesters, that's incredibly concerning considering that, as Chris noted, digesters rely on wet manure. Air quality is another major issue in Tulare County. The American Lung Association lists it as the fourth most ozone polluted county in the nation, second most polluted county in terms of year-round particle pollution. Those are two things, again, that are definitely connected to manure from dairies. And again, a 2021 study, I think there was a lot of news when this came out, in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, then that pollution from livestock results in around 1,700 premature deaths each year in the Central Valley, again, where Tulare County is located, primarily due to ammonia emissions and particulate pollution. I apologize. So a real case of environmental justice issues, right? Industrialized areas concentrated in a predominantly community of color that also struggles with high rates of poverty and a lack of investment in its infrastructure. And we'll dig into a little bit about how digesters then exacerbate all of this. But one of the things I want to show is this great map that SRAP put together that just goes to show how deeply concentrated, right, both the CAFOs are and the manure digesters. And you'll notice part of Tulare also is national forests and state parks, like Sequoia National Park is partially in Tulare. So it's really concentrated in one part of the county. The other thing I do want to note about this map is that we made the choice not to actually include like all the other livestock production. There are cattle feedlot there, other livestock production that's occurring. We really just wanted to kind of highlight and emphasize the dairy CAFOs and the manure digesters, but that is part of this conversation as well. And again, this is very much intentional. Research has well established that factory farm pollution disproportionately impacts communities of color, rural communities, and low-income communities. And the residents that we spoke with in Tulare definitely see those the political power of the agricultural industry as a major part of the problem. Representatives at the state and the federal level have deep connections, not just to agricultural industry, but the dairy industry, serving, leadership roles on industry groups. Many grew up or own dairies, right? And so again, as I mentioned, all the dairies in Tulare are large, and so those associated with digesters are similarly large. Because again, as Chris said, that's an essential part of having a digester and being able to produce manure biogas. They range anywhere from about 1,200 cows to about 15,000, so really big. We found that about 49 dairy digesters are operating in the county, accounting for that's about 11% of all manure digesters in the U.S. And again, California does a lot of digester clusters. And so that's basically a centrally located operation that receives raw biogas from surrounding digesters and then processes it, also known as like the hub and spoke model, if you've ever heard of that. There's about 15 clusters in California, and a quarter of them are just in Tulare County. And again, the rest are primarily concentrated in the Central Valley. And again, unsurprisingly, just like the CAFOs themselves, the biogas, these biogas companies are similarly concentrated. So these clusters are primarily run and owned by two different companies, CalBio and then Calgren or Mass Calgren, depending on the data source that you're reading. That's how it'll be referred to. So again, we see the communities closest to dairy CAFOs in Tulare County are now, dealing with air quality issues and water quality issues, but they're also now going to suffer from the novel forms of pollution from the digesters and other factory farm gas infrastructure that Chris had mentioned. And so what does that look like? These are just a couple different ways that both the digesters and production generates additional environmental, public health, and safety concern for those that live closest to CAFOs and biogas plants. So for example, right, digesters can increase ammonia emissions. A lot of that is from the digestate, which is the waste that's left over after the anaerobic digestion process. And again, that's a solid material. It's highly concentrated in nitrogen and phosphorus, major causes of concern in nutrient runoff and eutrophication. And digestate in particular is being promoted and sold as a fertilizer and land applied. Yet when it's super concentrated like that, it becomes much more highly soluble. So it's more likely to run off into the waterways and pollute them. And again, a community like Tulare that's already struggling with water quality issues, that's super concerning. Again, as Chris mentioned, right, oil and gas is super excited about this. Digesters can necessitate new infrastructure like pipelines, which again, residents mentioned they were surprised to learn about pipelines being laid in their community. They can also cause things like methane leaks. And again, this is a severe environmental injustice because CAFOs, again, as I mentioned, are typically located in areas that look like Tulare County. And so, they're exacerbating conditions that in a place like Tulare that's already overburdened by pollution. And, that's conveniently being ignored both by the state and federal government. One thing I really want to point out, especially is, biogas research has shown biogas plants can emit more criteria pollutants than comparable fossil fuel plants. And industry isn't really hiding that. One pilot project that was funded by the state, they put out a report all about it. And in it, they acknowledge that the digester project, and this is a quote from them, does not reduce criteria pollutants because when they're combusting the biogas, they know they'll burn the same amount of fuel as before, emitting substantially the same quantity of criteria pollutants. And again, a really great map from SRAP that just shows how devastating, in particular, air quality is in Tulare County and how the concentration of both digesters and CAFOs is exacerbating that. The other thing I want to note is that a common industry talking point when talking about digesters is that, digesters will help reduce the odors from factory farms. But when we spoke to community members, that was not the case at all, right? We explicitly asked, do the dairies with digesters, is that helping decrease the smell and the odors? One of the women we spoke with, Gloria, she has lived in Tulare for 50 years, and she says, no, it smells exactly the same. Similarly, Josefa, another woman we spoke with who has lived in Tulare for years, has said there isn't a huge change, that the smell issue is the same, and that specifically in the summer, it is worse. It is really, really bad. They don't want to go outside and barbecue. They're embarrassed to invite their family and friends over because of the odors. So again, not only is the water quality bad, the air quality bad, but digesters are exacerbating those things and really affecting the quality of life of the people who live in Tulare, but generally in the Central Valley. And one of the things we really wanted to highlight and emphasize as part of this is that there is a real issue with the data and the transparency in California. As Chris mentioned, we've done previous research, SREP and Friends of the Earth, and we found that dairies with digesters increase their herd size. But California, the data was a lot harder to analyze and really precluded a meaningful quantitative analysis of the relationship between changing herd sizes, the adoption of anaerobic digesters, and the incentives for producing manure biogas. We found multiple CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, in the county reporting varying herd sizes between the data maintained by the county, between their state permits, between applications for the low carbon fuel standard, one of California's main programs promoting manure biogas production, which we'll talk about in a bit. And again, part of that is all this data is self-reported. Additionally, another thing that we found a lot within, particularly within Tulare County's data, is name changes just subtly happening between, permits and what was maintained by the county. And it confused the county itself. We also found very similar names, right? Like families owning multiple facilities and having similar names causing confusion, making it ultimately made tracking very difficult, in addition to being complicated. And then, as we were really close to publishing this report, the California Air Resources Board actually compiled statewide herd size data, and they've created the California Dairy and Livestock Database, or CAD. And it uses a variety of data sources, including regional water board annual reports, inspection reports, county data, regional air permits. And so, I put together this very quick little chart that just shows total dairy herd size data, both from Tulare County, which again, this is relying on their individual dairy annual compliance report, and it's maintained by their resource management agency. And this is self-reported by the dairies as part of their annual compliance reports. And it's comparing it to what CAD says is, dairy herd sizes in Tulare County. Those are big differences, right? That's not like a couple hundred cows. That's not a couple thousand cows. This is like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of difference. And again, right, there's a lot, there could be tons of reasons why, but in light of the gaps and inconsistencies in herd sizes reported by the hundreds of dairies in Tulare County, CARB's reliance on CAD is a little bit questionable. Also, right, considering the significant evidence that dairies in the Central Valley are negatively impacting the health and well-being of the people who live there, it is essential that we have reliable, comprehensive data that can be used to examine the causal impacts of California state incentives for biogas on herd size trends, right? It's really important to understand the policy implications for these programs. But without having independently verified annual herd size data, that is incredibly difficult. And frankly, a little scary. Oversight is also a major issue, which again is compounding a lot of this. Since about 2010, we looked at, there were 1,300 violations of dairy operations. 95% of them were linked to informal enforcement actions, which is typically done by staff at the regional water board and includes things like just notices of a violation or verbal communication, versus a formal enforcement action, which is again typically issued by the water board itself, and includes things like cease and desist orders, civil liability, so actual teeth. And again, this is despite the fact that we found 70% of the violations were identified as a class 2, which are defined as violations that pose a moderate, indirect, or cumulative threat to water quality. So again, problematic enforcement, problematic when it comes to actual data, and problematic when it comes to transparency. And which really segues nicely into the next part, which is talking about tax-funded funded programs, right? There's a ton of both federal and state money that is going towards digesters and going towards manure biogas production. And as Chris said, this is really because it's being framed as a way to mitigate the climate crisis. And digesters are expensive. So looking at like the infrastructure, California state programs have provided a lot of money. And again, about a third of digesters are in California. And nearly every single digester in Tulare County received state dollars through the Dairy Digester Research and Development Program. There's also money coming in through the California Energy Commission through their Clean Transportation Program. And again, industry has admitted that partially this is because of the unreasonably high capital investment needed to build these things. We see help from local zoning laws too. Our research found again that, counties, including those including Tulare, have changed their local zoning laws to allow dairies to expand and add a digester without requiring project level California Environmental Quality Act review. And again, that's because it's being framed as an environmental solution, right? It's being framed as, oh, well, they're capturing methane emissions. This is a net positive from an environmental and climate perspective. We can just do this. Another thing we found that was incredibly problematic, considering, again, as we mentioned, about 50% of Tulare County demographics speak another language other than English at home. It's not obvious that the county provides any clear transcription or interpretation services. Like, they don't advertise that when they are putting out, their county meetings, any resources. A lot of stuff on the website is in English. And again, community members have really worked hard to advocate and push back against the fact that things are not offered in primarily Spanish. In addition to English, they've done that both on the local level and the state level, but it still remains a problem and really inhibits access to pushing back against the expansion of both digesters and factory farms. And then when we look, and again, all of this state stuff is in addition to the federal funding. Again, Chris mentioned that this is being framed as a climate solution. And again, through the Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level, billions of dollars have gone into conservation programs that are funding digesters. So programs like Rural Energy for America, as well as the Environmental Qualities Incentives Program, they're getting money to give to digesters, to give to CAFOs. But on the other side of that, there's also incentives for the manure biogas that's produced. And the two programs that are driving this, the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, which does mandate that a certain volume of renewable fuels, including biomass-based diesel, must be mixed in with more traditional petroleum-based fuels. And so this creates a guaranteed market for the biofuel industry, and manure biogas is a viable feedstock. But even more so, the low carbon fuel standard, which is a California climate program, has a outsized influence in terms of driving manure biogas production and the building of digesters. And so for those of you who are not from California, who might not be familiar with this program, the intent of it is to reduce the carbon intensity of the transportation fuel sector in California. And so the California Air Resources Board manages this program and sets the carbon intensity for transportation fuels. And so low carbon fuels below the carbon intensity standard that's set receive credits, while fuels above that carbon intensity benchmark receive deficits. And transportation fuel providers, right, they must show they're meeting the low carbon fuel standard by purchasing credits to offset any deficits that they have. So it's an offset program. And manure biogas has an extremely negative carbon intensity score, so it generates a large subsidy, a lot of money. And that is because the California Air Resources Board gives participating CAFOs credit both for reducing their methane emissions from manure by capturing those emissions. And again, this is problematic because they're assuming, their baseline assumption is that all livestock operations are managing their manure in wet, methane generating lagoons. They're assuming that this is an unavoidable byproduct of livestock production, when in reality, it is a choice. These dairies are making a choice to manage their manure in this way. And the reason it has a large subsidy is because they receive credit for replacing fossil fuels with a higher carbon intensity score. Another major issue with, the California Air Resources Board's calculation around manure biogas is it ignores all the up and downstream effects that come with livestock production. So they're not incorporating, like emissions from the feed itself, right? Things like that are missing. And that's a major issue when you're thinking about industrial livestock production, right? It's the whole system is a problem, both from an environmental perspective, but definitely from a climate perspective. And again, if you have this large subsidy that's coming from manure biogas production, there is no reason that these large-scale dairies or these biogas companies would want to change the existing system of factory farms to a more sustainable method of raising livestock, right? Because in order to maximize payouts, you have to maximize your methane production, which means more animal waste stored using the most methane generating manure management practices. They're incentivized to produce their primary greenhouse gas. And this again, right, is hugely problematic. And as Chris noted, despite heavy public investment in digesters, California is not monitoring methane emissions from CAFOs with digesters or collecting basic information, right? Neither is the federal government. And research has shown that biogas supply chains leak. And again, since CARB is not actually monitoring emissions at the facility level, they wouldn't know whether or not there are problems within this system. They're assuming that everything is great, that this is operating 100% perfectly. In fact, a 2023 paper estimated methane emissions from dairies in California specifically using mobile optical remote sensing, and it found that facilities presumed to have digesters did not emit significantly less methane than facilities without digesters. And then across all CAFOs in the study, measured methane emissions were actually 60% higher than rates reported in the CARB inventory. And again, right, CARB is relying on an assumption that the baseline from which methane reductions are measured is wet manure lagoons, right? So the most methane generating manure management practices, even though alternative manure management practices like composting manure have lower methane emissions and can be employed by dairies of all sizes. Again, we looked at Tulare County, 5 times as much money went to digesters in the county versus alternative manure management practices, despite the fact that that is a whole nother program that the California Department of Food and Agriculture has. I'm going to end by leaving you with this quote from Daisy, one of the women we interviewed as part of our case study, a 14-year resident of Tulare County. She notes that for her personally, her children are struggling with asthma. Her son in particular has become resistant to antibiotics and steroids, is consistently sick. She's driving all over the valley for doctor's appointment, trying to get her children help to be able just to breathe. And she said, right, dairies and the digesters, they directly harm her and her family. They are not a benefit for their community. So I will end there and pass it back to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Molly. I realize I neglected to mention that Molly is the author of this report. I'm just going to put a link in the chat. It's really terrific. Encourage you to read it. Especially encourage you to check out the environmental justice section, which starts on page 13, and particularly the section with quotes from impacted community members a few pages later. So with that, I will turn it over to Leslie Martinez with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability.
Thanks, folks. Hi, everyone. First, I just want to thank Friends of the Earth and TRAP for everything that they do. If you aren't familiar with their work, get familiar with it, because I think specifically in this fight with community residents that we've been working with, we're often being, when folks are sharing their stories about what it's like to live next to these CAFOs, what it's like to live next to 90% of the state's cows, which is the community we're talking about in Tulare. It's a small unincorporated community called Pixley. And I'm very familiar with it because I am born and raised in Tulare County. So I'm very familiar with the sights and smells. But I think when we started this campaign, it really started from community residents just being like, I have no idea how many cows I live next to. I have no idea how this is impacting my health. I have no idea, and I have no idea where to get this information. And then on the other end of it, it was when we're trying to figure out this information, when we're trying to engage in these processes, we have elected officials, we have agencies, we have professors saying, well, they're wrong. These people, those people that live in that community, they don't know what they're talking about. How would they know what they're talking about? And I think that this is one of the first times where we have had somebody say, actually, yes, they do. It's giving them data, it's giving them information to really paint an image of what it's like to live in Pixley, right? Paint an image. And I think there's living in Pixley, and then there's also living with the climate policies that our state government and federal government are pushing through without any community input, and they do not care about what that community input is if it does not fit the box that they want it to be, you know, in their climate friendly box. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the organizing we've been doing around the low carbon fuel standard specifically, because this is a state policy. It's going up to CARB it's been changed, it's been renewed, and we went through the whole process. I'm sure folks have heard about the gas prices, but you should not, while you should be concerned about gas prices if you want, like, I think the biggest concern is that, like, we're also funding this, we are funding some of the biggest polluters in the state of California. And instead of California Air Resources Board, the agency that's supposed to regulate to have clean air, rather than doing that, they are more concerned with securing the stability of these large animal facilities and the strength of those investments that are going into the dairy digesters, because there's billions of dollars at stake. And rather than thinking about how it's going to impact community residents, Molly talked a lot about water quality, she talked about air quality, but overall just, you know, living in Pixley and wanting to go outside and how that's impossible. But the problem is that the low carbon fuel standard, it entrenches us in this food system that we're going to rely on these giant CAFOs, and that is the best process to getting milk and dairy to our tables. And unfortunately, what we're really, I think what we're actually like subsidizing are these giant cesspools of manure. I'm talking like, if folks who aren't from the San Joaquin Valley have never seen one, I'm literally talking about a pool of manure and urine and water, and that is sometimes often less than a mile away from schools, from people's homes, and it's not just one. We're talking, I mean, we're in Tulare County alone, 90% of the state's cows live there. I don't know about y'all, but living next to 90% of the state's cows is not fun. It does not lead to great things for your health, for your mental health, and we're seeing that with folks. As we've seen the low carbon fuel standard really essentially pay polluters to continue polluting, and stick to this carrot approach, right? Because the California Air Resources Board does have the power to regulate the methane that is coming from these large CAFOs, and they have decided not to do that. They have made the decision that right now the low carbon fuel standard is working. And it's working because it's working for the big dairies and it's working for the big money investors. All while at that expense, what's costing us is community water systems. So for example, if you live in a small community or you have a private well, there's no programs for you to get free, you know, water testing. You have to pay for that on your own. Small water systems, cleaning out nitrate or any other contaminant that can come from a dairy is very costly. And when it's a small community, that cost gets, you know, equally dispersed among all the water users. And the dairy is like, wipes hands clean, they're good, that's not their problem. We've also continued to see, you know, we're really lucky, we're not lucky, but we get to talk to folks every day about what it's like to live before the digester and after the digester. And what we see is that there is no difference. In fact, it's worse. We hear the amount of trucks coming in and out of the community. We're hearing a lot about this really concentrated smell of ammonia that is like lurking from this digester. And also just like not knowing what's happening there. Like residents imagine you are driving to the grocery store and one day there's this giant facility and you have no idea what it's doing. There's just all the smoke coming out of it and nobody has told you what is there. If that is a huge issue for anyone, it should be a huge issue. It should raise flags for all of us. I think that I think something so important too is that as we're going into November 8th for the CARB hearing, one of the issues that is kind of at play is that they are going to the California Air Resources Board has presented to the board that the LCFS now will, for sure, for any project that hits the ground before 25 or the year of 2025, I think, I can't remember the year exactly, but they get 30 years of guaranteed crediting. What that means is for 30 more years, communities that live next to digesters or get a digester, they will be denied justice, they will be denied clean water, and they will be denied clean air, all because we are going to promote the health of large dairies, like large CAFO. And I'm talking like thousands of cows, folks. Like I cannot like underline how big these like dairies are in Tulare County. And it's really unfortunate because I also think about the people that I think about the small dairy farmers. I think about all these other different all these people who are trying to practice dairying different, who are trying to do the AMP projects, which is the alternative manure projects. And unfortunately, those folks are the ones that are really going to get caught up in this. Are going to get caught up in these new LCFS rules, because while CARB has said we're going to start regulating methane, we're not going to regulate the methane that if you have a dairy digester, you don't get regulated. And that is incredibly problematic for all of the all the small dairies that are trying to find a way to do it correctly. And it's again entrenching the system in the bigger the dairy, the more we're going to support it. And I think it's really important that community residents have been working on advocacy around the low carbon fuel standard specifically for over 3 years. And every single time we have had state representatives, we have CARB agency board members, staff, dismiss everything that comes from residents. If you look at comments residents have been raising about, what's going to happen to my community, what's going to happen to my water, and CARB has been silent on that because they have not responded at all, because they don't think that it's an issue. They don't think it's worth really addressing. So I think it's really important for us to, as we continue to build power and build knowledge in the communities that we work in specifically, we are trying to tell this story, and just we're so thankful for folks like Molly and Chris who have really helped describe what is happening to folks in Pixley and paint a real picture to it, because the low carbon fuel standard is going to lock us in for 30 years of supporting big dairy, big ag, and big oil. Like, let's not forget that this is also a way for big oil to make money. Like, and on top of that, I think the craziest part, I think literally the most insane part for me is, while we're doing this, they're putting all this money into this biogas or factory farm gas is what we call it around these parts. But when you think about factory farm, it's still polluting. It's a combustible fuel. It's not clean. And the communities that are going to be affected by that are the communities where it's being produced. And so like they will not be escaping this problem. Their air will not get better. Their lives will not get better. We're still going to continue to see the same trends. And the San Joaquin Valley has a plethora of other issues. And instead of really addressing what community is saying, really thinking about how do we make a food system that is focused on justice, that is focused on workers. No, it's business as usual with a greenwashing label on top of it. And I think that as we move forward, we're really trying to encourage folks to, be a part of the solution, be a part of calling out the low carbon fuel standard, calling out representatives, because we cannot live this way any longer, specifically the folks that live right next to dairies. And I wanted to address one other thing, and then I'll hand it over back to Chris. But and I think it's important to end on it. But I saw a note about, can you address why people don't just move? The community of Pixley is probably, so maybe half of it, or it's a historically Black community. So we have about half of it of Black folks who have been there before the dairies, and they'll tell you all about their life before the dairies came in. And then the other half, we have farm workers, many retired farm workers and retired farm and just farm worker families who live there because that's where the work is. For those that have never been to a community in the San Joaquin Valley, yes, there'll be a dairy, but also there's also all this other contamination from almonds, pesticides, all that stuff. So, these communities are really, they don't have anywhere to go, and nor should they. For one, I think if you, like, these folks worked so hard, and I know because I come from a family of farm workers, buying a house for some of these families is the single most impactful thing that they have ever done for their families. And for somebody to say, if you don't like it, move, is displacement. I think it's racism, and I think it is frankly just a total policy there's no coincidences, there's policy decisions. And this is a policy decision that's saying that the people in Pixley, the historically Black families, the farm worker families, don't deserve to have the same things as everybody else. And I'm done with the carrot approach. It's time to like really bring the hammer of justice down. And with that, I'll pass it over. But thank you so much again to Molly and Chris, because it's just so powerful when somebody backs up community. And I'll say, I say this to all the researchers that help us, but community residents also deserve somebody on their side. And so just so thankful for all the work that we've done together and for the work we will continue to do.
Thank you so much, Leslie. So many great points there. I can say as a California resident, I'm just absolutely furious that my tax dollars are going towards supporting that industry. I want to leave some time for the Q&A, but first, Molly, I'll pass it to you. I think maybe Leslie also to run through policy recommendations.
Yes, thank Chris. And before I kind of get into some of our organizations, FO, SRAP, LCJA, I want to mention, right, the residents we spoke with, and we were hoping to have one of the folks, Maria, who is an absolutely amazing community advocate. She lives in Tulare. She's been organizing a lot, speaking out at CARB meetings against low carbon fuel standards. She was going to join us, but was unable to. And so I did want to uplift some of the things, that they mentioned to us, in addition to, agreeing to with a lot of the recommendations that we made, particularly, right, direct regulation of the industrial livestock sector in California, particularly right in the Central Valley, ensuring that methane emissions are actually properly regulated, just like any other industrial sector would be. They really, they want the government to start thinking about what the dairies should be doing, and how it's their turn to make a change, that they've extracted enough from the communities that live nearby. Again, they want to see state investment in better infrastructure, better job opportunities, better, safe, affordable housing, right? A lot of times, one of the things that kept coming up when we were talking with community members was the fact that a lot of them had old homes. They couldn't open their windows in the summer because they didn't have screens on them, right? And they struggled with, landlords responding to them. And they have a ton of flies because there's so many cows and so much manure. And so opening your window, that means the odors are getting in, that means the flies are getting in. They really need like weatherization. But in addition to everything, all those really amazing points made about what they want to see happen in their community, there are a lot of things the government, both the federal and the state level, could be doing to make real change when it comes to our food system, but also take real action on the climate. That things like reforming the low carbon fuel standard. I think Leslie did a great job talking about, the fact that it's the time for carrots is over, right? We need to be pulling back these subsidies for manure biogas production. Companies can double dip between subsidies, tax incentives, between federal and state level programs. And there's absolute evidence of double counting between greenhouse gas reductions between these various programs, even just within the state of California. Funding and incentivizing manure biogas overall should end sunsetting the dairy digester research and development program, right? There, as Chris pointed out, tax dollars could be much better spent investing in sustainable, smaller pasture-based dairies, right? Putting food procurement towards more plant-based foods, reducing food waste, right? Lots of ways that conservation dollars could be used. And again, we have all these are important. The last thing I want to end, so we do have time for questions, is requiring publicly available like data from the CAFOs, from the digester operators. These things would go a long way. And again, independent verification of those numbers is essential, particularly in a state like California, where they have just so many cows. Really being able to understand the impact these policies decisions are having is essential, especially because, as Leslie said, people who are living there who, Josefa really, again, one of the women who's lived in Tulare County for a long time, she said it great. She's like, you could reach out your hand and touch a cow, right? Their lived experiences are being absolutely hand waved and dismissed. And frankly, for no reason. It's not like anybody is showing any sort of evidence that this is a net positive for this community. And so the last thing we'll leave you with, and Leslie, anything you want to add to this, but definitely one of the things we'll send out is actions that you can take to help support the community members in the San Joaquin Valley and their work to push back against this entrenchment of factory farm gas and factory farms by contacting the California Air Resources Board. There's a lot of good federal legislation that definitely moves us in the right direction when it comes to creating a more sustainable, climate resilient food system and really moving away from these large and incredibly large CAFOs. Also, again, just don't forget to vote. You know, your policymakers, they're the ones who are making decisions. So it's really important to use your voice and go to the ballot box. So please definitely make sure you're registered to vote. Leslie, is there anything you want to add before we turn it over to questions?
I'm just going to drop in the link for folks if they want to learn more about the CARB hearing, if you want to give a public comment. I also want to remind folks that these dollars don't just, these dollars while generated in California, they also go into other states. So like if you're from, there is a chance, if you live by Cape and they have a digester, there is a chance that Californians are paying for that as well. So just, I think that it's really important to get invested in these issues. And the other thing I'll note too is about the data point is we have known this is a problem. A UC Davis report in 2006 ordered by the state California legislature. One of their first biggest recommendations was it's really hard to figure out how bad this problem is because we don't have the data. And if you don't have the data, but we're already giving them and I say billions because it's literally billions of freaking dollars for infrastructure and also for these handouts. And yes, they are, a lot of dairies are making a lot more money on biogas than they are on milk. And you can look at that on your own time. But just a big push for making sure to engage in any and all types of rulemakings, and making sure that if you know a small dairy farmer and they're doing something right, they also have to speak out against the big dairies, guys, because at the end of the day, those are the folks that I feel that we're going to lose. And those are the folks that really need to be leading the charge for the food justice, like an equitable food justice, worker owned, all that good stuff. Like that can only come from those who are experiencing and doing the work. So yeah, we can go back to Q&A.
Amazing. Thanks, Leslie. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks. I have to say I've not been doing a great job of monitoring the chat because I've been paying such close attention to Molly and Leslie. But let's go from the back here. So Bob Martin writes that he's heard that some dairy producers are saying they're making more money from biogas than the milk they produce. What's the realistic assessment of being able to stop these? Good question.
I mean, Bob, I am an eternal optimist, and I think that the more that people learn about this, the more horrified they are, and the more likely that they are willing to kind of show up where we need them to show up. So be it reaching out to your federal legislators to be prioritizing policies that are not further entrenching both factory farms and fossil fuel systems. I think that's one. The second thing that I think we, collectively could be doing, especially in other states are trying to replicate what California is doing. They're trying to pass similar laws like the low carbon fuel standard, which again is pretty terrifying and really not what we want to see from a climate mitigation standpoint, from an environmental justice standpoint, from an industry consolidation standpoint. And so I think really paying attention to the laws that are being passed under this, to Leslie's point, right, greenwashed banner of renewable energy, really paying close attention to the role that manure plays in that. And again, I think really listening, just to reinforce what Leslie said, really listening to the folks that are living nearby to what they're seeing. Because again, I think that it's really easy to, sort of ignore that because it's inconvenient to what we need to happen, which is really, really big changes. And again, that's both from a climate perspective and an environmental justice perspective. So I really try and continue to say that we need to just continue to educate our decision makers and really bang the drum about this and educate other folks within the environmental movement, within the climate movement, people who care about animals, right? Like this is a really big tent issue. I think that we just need to continue to kind of bang the drum about and really push back against further expansion.
And if I could just add to that, Molly, and I say this as like an organizer and an advocate who has I think, very little qualms about pushing back on anyone. Like, we have to do this together and we have to do it united, yes. But also, like, I ask for our partners to be as like clear as possible. There are so many, the dairy industry does not care about being nice. The dairy industry does not care about being polite. The dairy industry lies. The dairy industry pushes hard. And frankly, I've looked at a lot of different rulemakings around water quality, air quality, and there it's the same play every time. Help us be better, help us be better. But I think that, like, as a society, we also have to say we need to redirect investments. If you work in, for example, if you're working in a clean energy, making sure that if you're a solar company, making sure no money should be going to any greenwashing field, or like biofarm. Like, we have to, on every single front that we have to call out the misinformation. We have to call out the impacts. And it's hard. I think some of the decision makers often feel uncomfortable being called, like, oh, this is a racist policy. But if we don't continue to say what it is, like, we are allowing these policies to continue to, like, not cement our food system. And I think that is the scariest part, is that while I also am a huge optimist, I also believe that we can't do it alone, and we need everyone to have all the audacity.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm quite as optimistic as Molly. I think we're not going to reverse this problem overnight. I do think, though, that there are strong arguments to be made in terms of economic efficiency. Like Leslie pointed out, we're literally spending billions of dollars on a technology that hasn't been properly proven, and causes all these other ancillary harms. So I don't know. I think there's certainly opportunity to push back on this, from being adopted by other species within the livestock sector, namely by poultry, because there is some application of the technology on poultry CAFOs, which makes zero sense because they actually have to add water to the waste in order to generate methane. So it's just incredibly resource intensive and incredibly wasteful. So again, I think maybe there's opportunity there as well. So a couple questions from Amy. Who is the they that is more concerned with CAFO revenues, and how is power wrested from CARB? And I think those probably are both to you, Leslie.
I think the they is both the biogas industry. I mean, last I checked, I think there's like maybe 2 or 3 companies that are receiving most of the subsidies that come from California for this. And on the other end, it's these really large dairy owners who put up an image, or not put up an image, but I would say that, like, really are. I also think that the big dairy farmers, some of them are also being played, because these are going to be deserted assets at some point, whether we want to recognize that or not. Like, this is not supposed to be forever. So I think that the day is the governor of California. I think it's who loves to pretend like the methane reductions are real, even though there's no, like, the math is not mathing for a lot of those methane reductions. I think the California Air Resources Board, and I think that the they is also really the biogas industry. In fact, one time there was, while community residents were giving, like, testimony, there was one guy who was a venture capitalist, and he said, I think we need to hear from people who have real skin in the game, meaning the people that are putting up money for these investments. So, like, I think that's a good, that's a good way to, like, phrase this. And also, because a lot of the people who used to work at CARB, oftentimes you will now see them working for the factory farm gas companies, for the renewable energy companies. I won't say any names, but you can just Google it.
Thanks. Technical question for Molly. Is there any data on how dry composting compares to the industrial digesters in terms of actual GHG reductions?
So actually, our previous report, Biogas or Bowl, which is available on Friends of the Earth website, and Chris will do me the huge favor of dropping the link into the chat. We actually did do some modeling of methane emissions based on a variety of different manure management strategies. And I think that's a really great place to start and take a look. But one of the things that we, Friends of the Earth and SREP, have particularly been pushing on the federal level is for USDA and EPA to be doing these studies as well, to really understand like what are the baselines that we should be starting with and what could we be promoting that is more sustainable and lower methane emitting than wet manure managed in a lagoon. But that would be a great place to start. And again, because we only have a couple more minutes, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out.
Great. Well, I think with that, we're going to wrap up. We'll look through the chat and find any unanswered questions. We'll reach out to you individually. But just a final bit of housekeeping. Thank you again for joining us today. This is an amazing set of presentations. At the end of the week, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording of the presentation and a Google Doc with resources on how you can support policies that prioritize environmental justice, climate mitigation, and family farmers. And I would really underscore the point that this is not an issue that affects just California. California's LCFS has immediate and dramatic impacts across the country in pushing factory farms to get bigger and produce more biogas. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.